forms of human trafficking. There is labor trafficking and there's sex trafficking. The Penal Code Statute 236.1 covers both of those forms of trafficking. Sex trafficking is often what we come across more than labor trafficking, and that involves a person that is forced to work in the commercial sex industry, and the victim may be an adult or a minor under 18 years old. And it can happen in various ways. You know, a person might find themselves being trafficked in the commercial sex industry because a young child ended up meeting someone that was older, and they ended up quote unquote falling in love, and this young girl ended up selling her body in order to make money. There are other situations where someone might come to the United States looking for work opportunities and then found themselves being forced to, again, sell their bodies. So these situations come up in various ways. With labor trafficking situations, what's more common that we've seen, and again, these are rarer, they don't come up as often as sex trafficking cases, but we've seen instances of victims being recruited from other countries and being told and being promised to be paid a certain wage, work a certain amount of hours, and then come here, and those promises are not kept, and the conditions of work end up changing. They're not paid what they're owed. There are a lot of myths and lies that are told to them in order to keep them working. So a lot of trafficking situations really center on the trafficker exploiting any weaknesses that a victim may have.
So we're going to give some examples of trafficking right now. I'm going to talk about a labor trafficking case and domestic servitude, and then we'll also talk about sex trafficking and exploitation, and break down the elements showing force, fraud, and coercion. So the first thing that we want to talk about is labor trafficking. So here's an example for labor trafficking. Mary was a young teen. She was 15 or 16 years old, from Peru, and a family friend had offered for her to go work in a Peruvian restaurant in the United States. And she was told that she was going to be able to go to school, and then after school, she would work 4 hours a day, and she would earn $10 per hour. So she'd be working roughly 20 hours a week. The reality is when she got there, she was not allowed to leave the house. She was controlled. Her in and out. She had no control over where she could go. She was under constant surveillance, and she was beaten when she actually complained. So that's an element of force. Then there were these false promises. So she was forced to actually sell magazines door to door. She never actually worked in a restaurant, and she did that 4 hours per day on school days. But then she also worked on weekends. She worked 10 hours per day, so 20 hours over the weekend. And that's our element for fraud, the false promises that got her there initially. And then she was threatened with deportation, and she was told that harm was going to come to her and her family if she didn't actually stay and pay off the debt. And her passport actually was confiscated. So we have the coercion, and then by confiscating her passport, there's actually force again. While it's not physical force, they've taken away her identification. So she has no ability or very limited ability to actually leave the situation.
It's about Kevin. Again, we often think of trafficking not within our backyard, not within our realm of people that we know. But Kevin was a young man who had a job but then lost it and was in really financially hard times. Someone came to the door, was selling a magazine, and they got to talking, and Kevin said, I don't have a job, I don't have any money, I'm not sure what to do. And so he was told by this person, oh, do you want to come and work with me? I make lots of money, everything is taken care of. So Kevin was recruited into selling magazines, and he was told that he would get a signing bonus plus great pay. So obviously he took it because he was looking for a job. Eventually what happened is that Kevin got no signing bonus. He and several guys were held in a home, and they were taken every day to go sell the magazines. They had to sell a certain quota. If they did not sell a quota, then they were billed for that. And it took Kevin a long time to extricate himself from this particular trafficking. So here is a young man living in the United States, met hard times, and yet was trafficked.
So an example for domestic servitude would be Nelia, and she was from the Philippines. And a friend actually helped her and her 12-year-old daughter come to the United States. And they promised Nelia that she'd be working and taking care of her friend's son and be working 8 hours a day and making $9 an hour. The reality is when she arrives, her and her daughter arrive, they're forced to sleep on the floor, and Nelia was sexually assaulted by her friend's husband. So there's force. And the promises were actually false, so there's fraud. Nelia received $200 each week, and she was required to work 16 hours a day. So that's the false promises and fraud, because she was initially told she was going to be working 8 hours a day maximum. And then her passport was confiscated when she arrived, and the trafficker told her they would call the police. They would tell them that Nelia had actually stolen something, that the police wouldn't believe her, that she would have to go to jail, and the police would come and take her daughter away from her. So that's the coercion. So that's the elements in terms of domestic servitude.
Many victims of sexual trafficking are children, runaways, or foster children who are taken either via online solicitation or who are actually kidnapped or taken off the streets. Many young people are taken because they want to be models, and they're promised all kinds of possibilities in their life. One example that I find most horrendous is the example of a young boy who in Palo Alto was taken for labor trafficking and knocked on doors and was selling magazines for college. What he really was doing, as he offered a little tiny business card to the woman, is he was available for sex. And he had to continue to do that until he reached his quota and he was a captive. The second example comes from a young woman who was telling me about recruitment of 13-year-olds in the Santa Clara Sports Complex. She was amazed. She lived 2 blocks from this place, and she, who had been well versed in her 4 years of high school on education about trafficking, really was amazed that 2 blocks from her house, she found out that 13-year-old girls were going into the Santa Clara Sports Complex and recruiting young women for sex trafficking. The third example is an example right here in Saratoga. When people say, again, it's not in your own backyard, it is. It was a restaurant owner and a nail salon. And the restaurant owner was trafficking 6 persons, 3 from Spain and 3 from the United States. 3 were trafficked for sex and 3 were trafficked for labor. What was most interesting about this example was the fact that the people in the neighborhood did not know this was happening. The person's survivors were rescued. The people were prosecuted, but many people had frequented both the nail salon and the restaurant and had no idea. Even one of the workers who was not trafficking said, well, the employers treated me well. He was not even aware that these persons were being trafficked.
So even though I actually broke down the different elements in both of the examples of the domestic servitude and the labor trafficking matter, we found force, fraud, and coercion in all of those hypotheticals. The reality is only one is required, only force, fraud, or coercion. And if we're talking about trafficking, sexual exploitation of a child, anybody under the age of 18, then we don't have that requirement of force, fraud, or coercion, because we know that anybody under the age of 18 can't legally consent. Therefore, they cannot be engaging in sexual exploitation. I mean, they can't be willingly be selling themselves. They don't have the agency to be able to do that. So for children that are sex trafficked, the prosecution and the district attorney won't have to show that force, fraud, or coercion. However, unfortunately, the law is flawed in that if you're a child and you're labor trafficked, the prosecutor will still have to show force, fraud, or coercion. Even though you're still a minor, you're still under the age of 18, you still cannot legally engage in contractual in contracts. But the law right now is that if it's you're a child and you're labor trafficked, the prosecutor will have to show force, fraud, or coercion. But the main point I think I'm trying to make in terms of adults or for children that are labor trafficked is that you don't have to have all three of the elements. You just have to have one of the elements.
So what are the signs of human trafficking? One of them is, of course, a person is very silent, quiet, especially in the labor or when you encounter someone. Someone may show the signs of physical abuse or emotional abuse. There may be bruises and cuts. There may be also signs of anxiety or overwhelming fear or lack of being able to communicate. When persons do not look at you, when people do not engage in conversations, when people are always afraid when they stay with a job and are not free to leave. Many of these are the ways in which you can tell that something is wrong. Suspicious behavior. One of the cases that I have seen and I did report on was a woman and children in front of the post office in my local city, Sunnyvale. And they were there when I went in and when I came out. They seemed very much afraid. The children were not in school. They were there not exactly begging, but anyone who is on a street corner, anyone who is trying to sell something, and they are underage and they are not in school, those can be suspicious signs of human trafficking.
Human trafficking is the illegal transfer of human beings from one place to another. It can be within boundaries of a country or across borders. In Uganda, it happens when you get any human being out of coercion or deceit from one place to another. Mainly the intention is for the trafficker. The victim does not know what is going to happen to him or her. The trafficker knows why you are being taken, either work, for cheap labor, or sexually.
Okay, so now we're going to give an example about a commercially sexually exploited child. We'll refer to her as Jane Doe. And when Jane Doe was 14 years old, she was exploited for the first time. However, the backdrop to that was when she was 9 or 10, she was molested by an uncle, and a couple years later was also sexually assaulted by her mother's boyfriend. When she's 14, she meets an older Romeo pimp who showers her with love and affection, buys her whatever she wants, and says, hey, you've never been to Disneyland. You really deserve a trip to Disneyland. Let's go. All kids should be able to go to Disneyland. So they head out to Southern California, and the reality is they don't make it to Disneyland. He takes her to Orange County and takes her to a hotel room and begins to exploit her. And she is forced to be in the hotel room. She's beaten when she resists. And they're there Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday morning, the boyfriend / exploiter actually leaves for a little bit of time. Tells her, "Don't leave. If you do leave, I'm gonna hunt you down and kill you." And so he does leave. She's frightened. She's horrified. She doesn't want to be there. She actually calls her mother, and she tells her mom, "I don't know what to do. This is what happened." And the mom says, "Well, call 911. Call the police. Get the police there." And so she does that. Jane Doe does call law enforcement, and law enforcement shows up at the hotel room, and they proceed to arrest Jane Doe for prostitution and solicitation. They don't actually go after the trafficker, the exploiter, the pimp. She gets arrested, and she, because she also at that point had a drug addiction, the boyfriend, the Romeo pimp, had actually got her addicted to drugs prior to the exploitation. She ended up being put in a group home a little over 100 miles away from her actual family. And at that point, being isolated from friends and family, she gets exploited again. She's very vulnerable. And something, very similar. They're providing her with drugs. She is exploited for a period of 8 weeks. And then she decides she can't live this life anymore. She self-reports. Law enforcement this time luckily does not arrest her. She actually assists law enforcement with the apprehension of the exploiters, and they subsequently get prosecuted. So because we're talking about a minor child, we're talking about somebody under the age of 18, law enforcement doesn't have to show force, fraud, or coercion for a case like that. But I think that if you review the hypothetical, that you'll actually see there are elements of all of the above.
Here are some examples about human trafficking. One is that of a woman who had a 16-year relationship. Her name was Mari, and the man's name was Daryl. They had gotten married, and earlier in their marriage it was fine. They had 4 kids, but then Daryl started running out of money. And he decided that one way to quickly make money was to begin to sell his wife as a commercial sex person. So he did that. She really did not want to do this, but he threatened the 4 children to harm them. He threatened her, and so she ended up saying yes to this. Then Janice came along, who was 18 years old, and he began, she was living with them, and Daryl began trafficking her also. The way they eventually got out of it was when they were in the car being taken by Daryl to a place where they would be engaged in sex, and the police stopped him. And the policeman noticed that Daryl had their identification, because Mari had wanted to get a driver's license prior, but Daryl had said no and would not let her get one. And he had taken away any kind of identification from her. So the police officer spoke to them privately and was able to get Polaris, which is the United States organization that helps people who are being trafficked, to help both Janice and Mari. Janice was able to leave Daryl immediately and eventually find a job working in a restaurant. Mari left Daryl eventually with her 4 children to another place out of state, but she still struggles very hard and wonders if she should go back to Daryl.
So the last hypothetical we're going to talk about is sex trafficking for an adult. And this fact pattern hypothetical we'll call the survivor Jenny Doe. And Jenny, at a young age, her mother committed suicide. I want to say she was around 10 years old. She ended up being placed in Child Protective Services, and she went from foster home to foster home, where in each home she ended up being sexually assaulted, sexually molested, abused. By the time she's 17, she's a runaway. She's not having any part of the foster care. And she meets an older gentleman who initially offers her shelter, care, food, relationship forms. There's trauma bonding that goes on. He begins to exploit her. He uses force, fraud, and coercion. And then the recruitment element kicks in, where the exploiter tells her that she has to do recruitment. So she engages, flirts around with a young woman who's 14 years old, and encourages the 14-year-old to have a threesome. It's all arranged by the trafficker. He's, forcing this to happen. She needs to do it or else. And then subsequently, she gets arrested along with her exploiter. The exploiter says it's all her idea. This is something she's been talking about. She's an adult now. And so the prosecution has to show that there was force, fraud, or coercion in that matter. However, she's a criminal as well, and she's being charged. So unfortunately for Jenny Doe, and in this example, while she herself was trafficked, law enforcement isn't necessarily looking at that element. They're looking at the crimes that she's committed directly.
Besides knowing that a person is maybe being trafficked, if you see bruises or any other physical things with that person, the other ways that you can tell is, does a person look at you in the eye? Say that you go to a nail salon, and does that person engage in conversation with you, or does that person look down and not look at you in the eye? So that is one way to begin to tell that maybe that there is there's something wrong here. If the person is disheveled, doesn't have proper clothing, that is another way that you can tell. If a person works long hours, that you come into a restaurant, say, and you go there early in the morning, then you come back later at night and that person is still working, that is another way that you can begin to tell. So I think being very observant is probably the best way. You know, when somebody comes to your door and is selling something, you know, one of the things that you can do is give them a card and say, if you need help, call this phone number, and it would be the Polaris hotline number.
So I just wanted to say quickly that the fact patterns, the hypotheticals that we are using, they actually are not real cases. They're a compilation of different varying cases, whether they're actual legal cases in a courtroom or hypotheticals from other attorneys that have just been combined. But the one about Jane Doe I think is really important in terms of it takes place in 2014. Currently, we have new law in California as of January 2017 that you cannot charge a minor with prostitution or solicitation. So very excited that we have that law. Many other states are passing very similar laws. And what's really important to keep in mind is that there's no such thing as a child prostitute. So we cannot be charging children with prostitution or solicitation because all we're doing is criminalizing the victims.